When I was a little boy, we had a set of Compton's Encyclopedia in our house. This was back in the old days when encyclopedias came in books. I liked to read when I was a little boy, and if I didn't have like a new Hardy Boys book to read or something like that, sometimes I'd take down a volume of that encyclopedia and look through it. Eventually, it became clear to me that my favorite volume of the Compton's Encyclopedia was the B volume. And there were two reasons for that. One of them was the article on beavers. They just fascinated me. Here were these little creatures who could build houses out in the middle of lakes with the entrance underwater. Now that was good for two reasons. One was the wolves couldn't get them in the winter, and when they had their babies were so buoyant that they couldn't swim underwater. So it was impossible for the children to leave home until the parents were ready for them to. And these beavers could drag sticks from the shore and line them up across the creek and make a whole lake just like that. I couldn't believe it. I used to go on picnics with my parents sometimes, and after we'd eat, there'd be a brook there, a stream, and I'd go down and arrange the rocks and sticks and things across that stream trying to dam it up. But I never made any difference in the flow of that stream, no matter how hard I worked. And here was a rodent who could do it. That was fascinating to me. The other article that I really liked in the B volume was the one about bears. Oh, they had great pictures. There was a great white polar bear running across a white snowscape. There was the great grizzly bear with that silver shoulder. There was the black bear scratching its back against the trees. There was a picture of a bunch of cars lined up at Yellowstone National Park and a bunch of bears lined up beside the road, and the cars were looking at the bears and the bears were looking at the cars. And in the very middle of the article on bears, there was a 2-page color cartoon story about a mama bear and her cub. Oh, that cub got into all kinds of trouble, but no matter what trouble that cub got into, that mama bear would rescue it. In the end, that cub climbed up so high in a tree he couldn't get down, but the mama climbed up that tree until it bent over and the cub could step off on the ground. I learned from Compton's Encyclopedia, you never want to get between a bear cub and his mama, because that mama will do anything to protect that cub. Now, when I got to be about 11 years old and we had a scout troop in our church at home, I decided I'd join up. I'd become a Boy Scout because Boy Scouts go camping, and maybe I could see some beavers and some bears. So I joined the Boy Scouts and we went camping, but the only place we ever went camping was Pinckney Whitson's farm. We saw birds and squirrels and chipmunks, the kinds of animals I could see right at my home. The only big animals we ever saw were cows. That's where we went camping, and I remember we put up these canvas pup tents. They told us to dig trenches around the edges of the pup tents, so if it rained at night, we wouldn't get wet. So my friend Bob and I would put up our pup tent, and we'd dig a trench around it. And one night, sure enough, a big old storm came through, and it was just raining and thundering and lightning, and we were lying there in that tent awake, and we were thinking about what they told us. They told us, if you're ever in a canvas pup tent in the rain, don't touch the canvas, because if you touch the canvas, like magic, it will start leaking. Now, why would they tell an 11-year-old boy something like that? Of course we wanted to touch the canvas to see if it was true. Bob said to me, "Touch the canvas." And I said, "No, you touch the canvas." So he laid there in his sleeping bag for a minute, and finally he said, "Okay," and he reached up right over me and touched the canvas. And sure enough, after about 2 seconds, this little bead of water formed on the inside of the tent, and drip, it fell down on my sleeping bag. And drip, 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 it fell down on my sleeping bag. But that didn't really matter, because you remember that trench we dug around our tent? Well, that was bringing water from all over the field right into our tent. We were lying in about 3 inches of water by that time anyway. After a while in the Boy Scouts, when I realized I wasn't going to see anything but Pinckney Whitson's cows, I decided to get out. I decided camping is not for me. Now, when I got into the 9th grade, my parents sent me away to boarding school, and that's where I met a man named Bob Pay. I liked Bob Pay. He was one of my phys ed teachers, and he taught me all about soccer. I'd never played soccer before. And he taught me about gymnastics, how to walk on my hands and tumble, and best of all, he brought out the trampoline, and he taught me all kinds of tricks on the trampoline. I liked that. But one of the things I liked best about Bob Pay was he had a daughter named Wendy. She was 1 year younger than me, and she was changing by the day, and I just loved to keep in touch with Wendy to see how she'd changed. I really kind of liked Wendy. So one day when Bob Pay said, I'm inviting a few friends over to my house, we're going to make pizzas in my kitchen. See, this was before the time you could just call up and have them brought to your house. We were going to make pizzas, and after supper, he was going to show us slides of a canoe trip in Canada. He said he'd bought a camp right up on the Canadian border, and he was looking for boys who might like to go that summer up on a canoe trip in Canada. Well, I wasn't much interested in a canoe trip, but I was interested in pizzas, and I was interested in making pizzas and eating pizzas with Wendy, so I said I'd be there. So I went to his house that Sunday night, and we made pizzas, and we saw the slides, and when it was all over, I told Mr. Pay I really wasn't interested in going on that canoe trip. He looked a little disappointed, said okay, and I went about my business. The next weekend when I went home, I told my mama what I had decided, and she looked a little disappointed too, and she didn't say anything for about 2 or 3 weeks, and then one of the most amazing things in my whole life happened. I've thought about this a lot. I don't quite know how it happened, but here's what happened. I went home again for a weekend, and my mama said, "You look kind of sad. Have you been thinking about that canoe trip? Have you been wishing you'd decided to go on it?" Now, I can sort of imagine why my mama might have said that, because I was really small for my age and not very athletic, and she probably thought that canoe trip would be good for me. It might help me grow up and get stronger. I can understand why she might have asked that question. But what I have never been able to figure out is why I answered it the way I did. Right out of the blue, right out of my mouth, came the words, "Yes, I think I would like to go." I don't know why I said that. I hadn't been thinking about that canoe trip, but there it was, and almost before the last words got out of my mouth, my mama whipped out her checkbook, wrote a check, said, "Give this to Mr. Pay when you get back to school." I did, and he looked really happy that I was going, and so it came to pass that one day that next summer I found myself in Birmingham, Alabama, getting on a train that was going to take me and a bunch of other boys from Alabama up to the Canadian border for a 19-day canoe trip in the wilderness. My mama gave me a Dramamine to take in case I got sick on the train. That night I was lying in my little berth on the train watching the houses go by and the lights, the little orange lights coming out of the kitchen windows, and the mamas standing at the sinks washing their dishes. I could see all that as we went across the countryside. And I did get sick, but it wasn't the kind of sick that a Dramamine was going to help. I got homesick. Mr. Pay met us at the train station and drove us way on further north into the woods to his camp he'd bought, and I'll never forget that first evening standing there beside that lake looking at all those canoes lying bottom up on the shore all in front of me, and it suddenly occurred to me for the first time on this great adventure that I had never even been in a canoe in my whole life. And here I was about to go on a 19-day canoe trip in the wilderness. Well, we spent 2 or 3 days there at the home place, sort of getting prepared. Part of getting prepared was learning how to paddle those canoes, how to make them go the way we wanted them to go with the different strokes, the J strokes and the sweep strokes and things like that. I learned the best I could, and then for our sort of final test, Mr. Pay got out in a canoe by himself on the lake, and he put us in other canoes and told us to paddle one at a time, paddle as hard as we could straight toward him. At the last minute, he would shout left or right, and using those strokes that we'd learned, we were supposed to make our canoe turn and not ram into his canoe. Well, I started paddling toward his canoe, and just at the last minute, he hollered, left! And of course, I looked down at my arms to see which hand my watch was on, because that's how I told which was my left hand. That's how I could remember that. But I'd left my watch on the shore because it wasn't waterproof. By the time I figured out which my left hand was and which way I was supposed to go and started thinking about which stroke to use, bam, I had crashed right into his canoe. The next day, he piled us all into a couple of station wagons with trailers behind us hauling canoes and packs, and we drove even further north to the very end of the road to Moose Lake, where we were going to jump off for our 19-day canoe trip. We put the canoes in the water, we loaded the great big old Duluth packs in the canoes, and then he started assigning us all to our canoes. Someone in the front, someone sitting on a pack in the middle, and someone in the back. Everybody got assigned to a canoe except me. And for just a minute I thought, maybe I'm not going to have to go on this trip after all. But at the very last minute he said, I would be sitting on the pack in the middle of his canoe. His son, Jerry, would be in the bow, and he would be in the stern. They were our guide and our assistant guide on this trip, and I would be in the middle. I took that to mean he doesn't think I can do this. And as we got in the canoes and pushed off onto the water of Moose Lake, I was determined to show him I could do it. So we started up the lake, and I was paddling. My paddle was out on the left side of the canoe, and I paddled, 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 and pretty soon I thought my left arm is going to fall off any minute, and I've got to do this for 19 days. And then from the back of the canoe, he hollered, switch. And all at once we switched the paddles over to the other side and started paddling, and I was on the right side, and my right arm felt so much better, and I paddled, and I paddled, and I paddled, and I paddled, and then I paddled some more, and after about 10 minutes, I thought, now my right arm's going to fall off, and I've got to do this for 19 days. Eventually, we came to land. This was called a portage, where we had to carry everything to the next lake. I was so glad to step out on the land, I could hardly stand it. Maybe I can survive after all, I thought to myself. Then Mr. Pay picked up one of those 60-pound packs, maybe 65. I weighed about 90 pounds myself. He picked that pack up and put it on my shoulders, and all of a sudden I bent over so that I was looking straight down at the toes of my shoes, and I took off across that portage. All I saw on that portage was the ground in front of me, except toward the end I started looking up as much as I could to look for water. Please let there be water soon so we can get out of these packs. And I trudged on until we finally came to the next lake, and I rolled over like a turtle with that pack underneath me, and I climbed out of it, and I said, thank goodness we're back to water, and we got back in the canoes and started paddling again, and my arms started hurting again. We finally reached campsite the first night, and I was still alive. We took a nice dip in the lake, and that felt good. And we had a good supper. We even had some fresh food that first night, and that tasted good. That evening, just as the sun was going down, my tent mate and I, Howard and I, we both slathered up with insect repellent, and we went out and sat on the very end of a high rock overlooking the lake, and we watched the sun go down. And we looked as far as we could in every direction across that lake and realized you could go in 100 miles in any direction except the one we just come in and not reach a single piece of civilization. It was so quiet. You could hear the lake sort of breathing, sort of sighing against the rock down below our feet. And every now and then you could hear the strange sound of loons calling. Woo! Woo! I had never heard anything like that. Closest thing I'd ever heard to that was when my friend Al used to tickle his older sister. It was amazing to me. We finally went and crawled in our tent and slept and woke up the next day feeling better, and we went on, and over the next few days we'd come around a bend and there would be a deer. We actually saw a moose one afternoon, and we camped not long after that. After supper that night, Mr. Pay asked me if I would like a new experience. Still determined to show him that I could do this, I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "Put on some insect repellent and come with me." And the two of us paddled off. And he went around a point near where we'd seen that moose, and he pulled up to shore, and he said, "Now you hop out. You find you a comfortable place to sit up there on the shore where you won't have to move around much, and you sit as quietly as you can. Don't move for as long as you can, and just see what you see. I'll be back for you after a while." And he paddled off. And he left me there on that point in the middle of the Canadian wilderness, all by myself, and I sat there and I didn't move. Well, I didn't see a moose, and I didn't see a deer, but I began to see things I had never noticed before. I saw the little flowers blooming along the shore there. I saw water striders with their long legs just walking around on the surface of the water like they didn't know they couldn't do it. And just under the surface of the water, little black specks of life swimming around in frantic chaos. And I began to smell the pine smell of the forest. And I sat there for what must have been more than an hour, just being there and taking it all in. I don't know how long I'd been there when I heard the bear. I heard the bear right behind me. A stick cracked, and a bunch of leaves started getting kicked around, and I could hear the bear back there in the woods behind me, but I knew I wasn't supposed to move, so I just sat there to see what would happen. It got quiet for a while, and my imagination was going, and pretty soon, even closer to me, I heard the leaves again crackling and kicking around and sticks breaking, and I didn't move. But finally, it was so close behind me, I couldn't stand it any longer, and I jerked around and scared a poor little chipmunk half to death. It wasn't long after that Bob Pay came paddling back around that point, and I got back in the canoe and went back to the camp, and I told him about the things that I'd seen, and what I didn't tell him was I figured I'd probably never forget that evening that I'd spent sitting there on that rock. Well, the trip went on. We caught some fish and cooked them right there over the campfire, and we just started having a really good time. We got into this one lake called Pooh-Bah Lake. You had to go up a beaver stream to get in that lake, and it was windy through the grasses and fun to go back in there. It felt so wild and remote, but once we got into Pooh-Bah Lake, Mr. Pace said, "Now, we're going to have trouble getting out of this lake because there are 3 long portages out of this lake. Each one is about a mile long, and they're only separated by little potholes. Potholes are smaller than lakes. You can paddle across a pothole in about 1 or 2 minutes. And so we were all sort of dreading that. But the night before we left Puba, we saw something swimming out in the middle of that lake. We jumped in our canoes and we paddled out there to see what it was, and it was a deer. It was swimming right across that lake, and we paddled along right beside it till it got to the shore, and we watched it bound into the woods with its white tail flag flying high. The next day, we went back over to that shore of Puba, and we found our first portage, and we started in that portage, and it was about halfway up to our knees in mud. Had one of those big, heavy packs on my back, and I was just sinking in the mud and squishing my shoes in and out of that mud for about 30 yards or so, and then I came to a sheer cliff right in front of me. You could tell people had been climbing up that cliff because what dirt there was on it was just worn flat. We got out ropes, and people would climb up the cliffs as much as they could and tie the ropes to trees, and we hauled the packs up that cliff and hauled the canoes up that cliff and then hauled ourselves up that cliff. And I thought, well, I was worn out, and we weren't but about 30 yards over 3 miles of portage, but I got up to the top and thought, at least it won't be muddy up here. And then I discovered that nature is not logical. We got up on top of that cliff and discovered we were in beaver ponds up there. Everything was swampy and muddy and mucky. There was one point where I was walking along with my face down, of course, bent over in an L shape, carrying that 65-pound pack on my back, and I was looking at the grassy trail underneath my feet as I went along, and I noticed that the grass would kind of move out in waves every time I stepped, and I realized I'm walking on top of water. This grass is growing on top of water. Pretty soon, I noticed a canoe line, bottom side up, on the trail right in front of me. I kind of stepped around it and was walking along beside it when I heard this voice from underneath the canoe saying, "Get this thing off me!" Which was easy for me because I was already bent over. I just reached my hand and rolled the canoe off to the side, and there was one of us, up to his waist in the grass. He'd broken through. When we got over those 3 miles of portages, every one of us had mud in our shirt pockets. We were so tired, we took the first campsite we could find on Brent Lake. Now, the problem with this campsite was it didn't have enough tent sites on it for all of our tents. Mr. Pay noticed there was a small island just off the shore there, and he said, I bet we could get one tent on that island if we could use the smallest boys to sleep on it. It wouldn't be a full tent site, but I bet we could find a flat space. So, of course, that was my tent. So Howard and I put our pack in the canoe, went over there, and found sort of a flat place, and we pitched our tent, and we spent the night there. Next morning we got up and took our tent down and packed our pack up and put it in our canoe and paddled back over to the main campsite for breakfast. We landed our canoe, we took our pack out and put it on the shore like we were supposed to. We pulled our canoe up on the shore, and we went up and we ate breakfast, and then everybody else got their packs down to the shore and their canoes down in the water, and we all loaded the packs in, and we went on down Brent Lake. We had about a 3-hour paddle down Brent Lake before we came to our first portage. Then we had a series of little portages over small lakes, and finally we got to our next campsite where we were going to stop on a lake called Ted Lake. When we unloaded all the packs, Howard and my personal pack was not there. Mr. Pay said, "Didn't everybody have the same number of packs in your canoe today that you did yesterday?" And one of the canoes said, "No, sir, we had one less 'cause we got rid of a food pack." Mr. Pay said, "That food pack came out of our canoe, not yours." We had left our pack back on Brent Lake. He said, "We'll have us a quick supper, and I'll take somebody back with me, and we'll go fetch it." And there we were eating our supper when Mr. Pay came over to me and said, "Bill, would you be willing to go back with me and get that pack?" A part of me, of course, said, "I'm exhausted. I don't want to do that." But the biggest part of me said, "He thinks I can do it." And I said, "Yes, sir, I'll be glad to." And after supper, he and I jumped in a canoe and we started paddling, hut, 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 as fast as we could across that lake. And when we got to the portage, I didn't have anything to carry but the paddles, so I could go pretty quickly over this portage, and he trotted along with the canoe on his shoulders. Our goal was to get back over the last portage before full darkness set in, and we just barely made it. We pushed out onto Brent Lake, and it was dark. And Mr. Pace said to me, "Now this is different, paddling at night. Tell you what, let's be as quiet as we can." So we paddled out onto Brent Lake without saying a word. And in the full darkness there, with no moon out, the sky was just full of stars. You could see the Milky Way just swirling overhead, and there was not a breath of wind on the lake, and so the lake was like a mirror underneath our canoe, and I was sitting in the bow, so our canoe hadn't even disturbed the surface of the lake, and it looked to me like I was floating through the universe with all those stars overhead, and every single one of them reflected on the surface of that lake. And then, overhead to the north of us, there suddenly appeared curtains of light. And we both stopped paddling, and we both said, "Wow." I said, "What's that?" Mr. Pace said, "Nobody knows, but they're called the Northern Lights." And we just sat there drifting on Brent Lake for a long time, just watching these curtains float around in the sky like they were being blown by some high, high wind. Finally, the moon came up over the shore, and that kind of dimmed the northern lights, and so we started paddling along again. And the moon, reflected in the surface of the lake, made a kind of a highway for us to paddle up, a highway of light, and we were just paddling up that lake in the moonlight. And I began to notice that all along the shore to the side of us there were fireflies. Looked magical, just blinking on and off. But you know how, along about midnight or so, the Stephen King part of your brain turns on. I was watching those fireflies along the shore, and I noticed there was one light that wasn't doing right, I thought. It was steady, and it was moving along just like we were, just like somebody carrying a flashlight along the shore, and every now and then it would blink out as it went behind trees, but there it was again, and it was just going along the shore right beside us. And I began to think, now who could that be? And why are they there, and why are they following us up this lake? And I watched it, and I kept telling myself, no, it's just fireflies, but I watched it some more and thought it's not acting right. And finally I decided I need to tell Mr. Pay about that. And at the very moment that I opened my mouth to say something about that light, bam! It sounded like someone had thrown a big rock in the lake, and it landed about 5 yards off the bow where I was sitting, and I nearly wet my pants. And Mr. Pay jumped too in the back of the canoe. I could feel him, and then he laughed. I said, "What was that?" And he said, "That was a beaver." And all the way back up Brent Lake that night, the beavers would slam their tails into the water ahead of us. Sometimes I could see the water fly up in the moonlight as they escorted us up that lake. We got back to the campsite finally where we'd been the night before, and there was our pack. We set up our tent. We got out our sleeping bags, and Mr. Pay and I spent the night there. And the next morning we got up and we started back down Brent Lake, back across all those portages, back to Ted Lake, where the others had already left to go a bit further on, and so we went further on too. And when we got to the very last portage of the day before we were going to come to Robinson Lake, where our group was camping, I noticed that the portage started off with a little hill. Bob Pay put that pack on my back, and I started up that little hill, and when I got to the very top of that hill, I stopped, because down at the bottom of the hill on the other side, there was a bear looking up that hill at me. And I was still standing there when Bob Pay came along with that canoe on his shoulders. He said, "What's the matter?" And I said, There was a bear down there." He said, "Oh, really? Cool. Was it a big one or a little one?" I said, "It was just a little one." He said, "Oh, it was a cub. Oh, don't worry. The mama's probably around here somewhere." And he took off down that portage fast as he could go and left me standing there by myself on the top of that hill, remembering what I had learned from Compton's encyclopedia. Never get between a cub and his mother. I listened to every sound in the forest as I went down that portage, but I never saw the mama bear or the cub again. Well, we finally caught up to everybody else and told them about our adventures, and a few days later we were breaking our last camp, paddling back into the home place. We loaded up our canoes in the rain. We had our ponchos on. We got in the canoes and we started paddling across that lake with the rain falling, and I'll never forget the feeling of it. I took the hood of my poncho down off my head because I didn't care if I got wet. I wanted to hear the sound of the rain falling on the lake. I wanted to hear the sound of my paddle going through the water. I wanted to hear every sound of the loons and the gulls and everything else I could hear. And I remember thinking to myself, I almost didn't do this. A few days later, I got back home to Talladega, Alabama. And that night, I climbed in my bed, in my own bedroom, in my own home, and I looked out the window and I saw the moon come up. And I felt the strangest feeling I may ever have felt before. I felt homesick.